Welcome to the Awe and Wonder podcast. I'm Sarah Kinsella,
I'm Brenda Del Monte.
and today we're joined by Beth Poss, and we're talking all about literacy in this series. So we're really excited to talk to Beth and pick her brain about some literacy instruction ideas and just see what she's been up to. And so, Beth, let's hear from you. Do you mind starting off with just a little introduction? Tell us about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. So, hi everybody. My name is Beth Poss, and I am a speech language pathologist by training. I spent over 30 years working in the public schools in a variety of settings, and including the last 10 years of my career, basically. I was in school administration, so I worked in central office, supervising special education services. And then I moved into an assistant principal ship for the last 3 years that I was with the schools. I retired in December of 2019 from the schools, and I went to work for Lesson Picks. So if you're familiar with Lesson Picks, I do work full time for Lesson Picks, but I also do a lot of consulting and presenting outside of my role with Lesson Picks. And I'm also one of the co-authors of the book, Inclusive Learning 365 EdTech Strategies for every day of the year. So yeah, I feel like I've been around for a long time and done a lot of different things. But literacy, especially for students with complex communication needs, individuals who use AAC, has always been really important to me. I always felt like it was just, such a critical component of being an effective communicator, with having access to literacy instruction, and not just for communication, just for life, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine my life without books and literature in it. And so I wouldn't want any learner to be deprived of opportunities to develop literacy skills, so that books can be an important part of their world as well.
Yes. And what a great background you have with all the experiences and some in administration. I think that brings so much to your perspective too. And probably you had a great perspective as administrator. I know we always love when, there's someone who's been in your field and is in administration. You're like, yes, you get this. That's so exciting. So I'm sure you have so much to bring to the field, partly because of that. And we love the book, Inclusive Learning 365. That's such a good book. So thank you for all your work on that.
Thank
Um,
you.
when you think back to your 30 years in education in the schools, is there a student that comes to mind that kind of blew your socks off when it came to literacy skills, or someone that just kind of made you think differently about this?
So I really think it's less about like the one student, and I have one student that, we were just like, wow, we didn't know all that was in there. Um,
Hmm.
but I think it's really more about just those students who, because you provide effective literacy instruction, start to develop skills and make progress. They're still kids with disabilities, and they're still kids with complex disabilities.
Hmm.
And they are the kids that are not going to ever maybe develop conventional literacy skills in terms of, being able to independently read a chapter book all by themselves. But they're the students that, because you continued with effective literacy instruction, and believe me, literacy instruction has changed so much throughout, from when I first started in education to now. But
Hmm.
when you provide effective literacy instruction, it opens up the ability for them to, find a word based on the first letter sound in their communication device. It allows them to have more independence in their community in terms of what they're seeing, in the grocery store, on menus. It allows them to have favorite books that they enjoy, and that they, can be more independent with, and, allows them to text to their peers and to their family, or to write emails, even if that's supported. So it's really less about that one kid who was like, wow, who knew that they were a conventional reader locked inside a body, than it is about all of the kids that just had more doors open to them because we kept slogging along with literacy. Even though people said, well, they need to work on functional life skills now. It's like I always say, the most functional skill of all, the most functional life skill of all, is literacy, right? It opens more doors. So I think it's really about that. It's really about that instead of the one kid. I mean, I can tell stories about the one kid too, but it's about all those kids that we just
Yeah.
Well, you said something that sparked my interest, and I know what I've seen over the years, but I feel like I wonder how you would describe what literacy instruction looked like when you started and what it looks like now. Because to me, it looked like literacy entertainment, and now it looks like instruction. But I don't know if I see you nodding, but so describe for people maybe just coming into the field, like what did that used to look like, and what is good literacy instruction now?
Well, I mean, I go back to, yes. And I remember, like, they talk about the pendulum in literacy instruction in general education, like it swings.
Right.
I remember, hooked on phonics. And then I remember balanced literacy. And I even think about it in terms of my own children who are adults now. And now, now we're back to, systematic sequential phonics, and, which is really important. I totally agree with that. But I think mostly back, yes, it was about, entertainment. And, we did good things back then. Like, we adapted books for motor access and put page fluffers in, and all of that. But I just go back to all of the years that I spent. I remember I had like 2 or 3 summers where I got hired in the summer to adapt books, meaning to symbolate books, right? And so we symbolated all of these books for so that, we made adapted versions of gen ed texts, which was great that we were making adapted versions of gen ed texts, that we made an adapted version of, whatever, Romeo and Juliet or something like that. But then we symbolated it. And we spent so much time, symbolating text, and thinking that was going to improve reading skills and communication skills for our students, when the reality is it doesn't, right? We know now that symbolated text is not an effective strategy for reading. It doesn't teach kids how to decode a word. It's simply and that at best it helps them memorize an association for a word, and at worst it just overwhelms them, so they don't know whether to look at pictures or text or anything.
Right. And I'm just gonna just clarify for people that symbolated text, like you described really well, is just adding a picture to a word, or adding a symbol to the word. And so you'll see this. We still see this, right?
Oh, we do.
And so, yeah, thank you. Thanks for explaining that.
No, you're welcome. Yeah, no, please. Yes, exactly. It's where we would put a picture for every word in that text. We would put a picture to go with it. And we would usually have, the pictures above the word or below the word, or whatever. It wasn't, and so it's kind of like when we know better, we do better. And there is no good research out there that shows symbolated text improves reading for anybody, let alone for students with disabilities. And there is certainly much more research that shows that we need to provide comprehensive literacy instruction, including strong alphabet awareness and phonics instruction, along with comprehension and vocabulary for students, even students with complex communication needs, and that those students with complex communication needs, the same way that repetition is so important with other aspects of learning for them, that this is not something that we give up on. The rate of success is going to be slower, and it's not something we give up on, so that we can instead address functional life skills, because we need to learn how to, it's way more important that we learn how to set a table,
Yeah.
Right.
Then read
we
the
know
menu.
how to unload a dishwasher and sort the, I would so much rather, I mean, I'm telling you, my husband still doesn't know how to unload the knives and forks and spoons from the dishwasher, and he's totally functional in other ways.
I remember those the reading, like, oh wait, symbolating text doesn't help kids learn to read, and I began to take the symbols out of the message window of AAC, and noticing that kids were hitting the message window and seeing what that did and paying attention to text more. And you're right, it's know better, do better, right? So it's like it not only changed the literacy instruction, but a little bit of the AAC stuff, and even not being afraid of buttons that don't have any picture at all, the ones that have just words, and even removing a picture from a button if you knew they had that sight word. I mean, there was a lot that kind of went together with that literacy in AAC, when we kind of realized, that's not actually that's not achieving what we hoped. And by the way, saving us a ton of time and laminate and all the things that went into that, right? Because
Absolutely.
that was a lot of work. Yeah. So, within your role of AAC and literacy, what are some of the guiding principles that you've learned along the way?
Oh gosh, there's just so many. I mean, I think the importance of wait time just can't be understated. It is for us as adults with finely tuned communication skills, we find wait time really difficult, right? If I were to wait and pause for 5 seconds before responding, I'm going to do that. I'm going to count to 5 seconds in my head. It would feel like, to us, it feels awkward. Like there's silence that needs to be filled. Like they're not paying attention, or right. But we know that our learners with complex bodies, or who are using communication systems where there is not the same motor automaticity that we have with language, or even those individuals who have emerging oral language skills but are trying to figure out like that motor processes, 5 seconds is really not that long of a time. And so I think it's that value of wait time. I worked with a student many years ago, and we kind of figured out that the time that it took her to respond to a question, so you would ask her a question, and both for the motor organization, the language processing time, and the organization of a response in her head, that it took about 12 seconds for her to be able to respond. And that when we didn't give her that time, she just sort of became this passive, she had become this very passive learner, where she knew no one was going to give her time, or she would say something, but it would be like, so last, right? Like it would have like related to something we said like 5 minutes ago or something like that. And there was this big disconnect. But when we gave her the time that she needed and reinforced that, and a strategy that a lot of people would do would be like, now you think about it and I'll come back to you. But it's like that doesn't make you feel like what you have to say is that important. And then there's all these other messages and things that am I supposed to listen to what my peer said also and listen for the
Mhm.
next question while I wait for that person to come back to me and I can answer that question? It's like, no, the respect that we give that individual is to sit there and wait for that response and to wait there with I'm I want to know, with the attitude of I want to know what you have to say. So I think that's one of the biggest things is providing wait time and knowing that we don't have to fill the silence as much as we are inclined to want to do so, right? To not have, and I'm the worst about that. My kids will tell me, Mom, you don't have to talk we don't have to have a conversation every moment in the car. And it's like, I know, but it's like, it's just empty, right? And so our inclination as social beings is to fill that silence, but to give
Mhm.
that wait time. So I think that's one of those things. And to realize that that's with communication, but it's also with, you know, the time that it might take them to process the visual information that they're receiving in text, all of that. So I think wait time is is probably one of those things.
That brings something to mind though. What I love about being able to videotape now on your phone is that you can actually see the wait time, right? When you
Mhm.
watch the video back. I had a boy though that he was doing two-step scanning, auditory preview, right? So he was writing a story this day and he was filling in a word. So it was like, okay, so once upon a time there was a boy and I'm like, and he went to animals. I was like, okay, who's on the walk with the boy? And it took him like 20 seconds to even start the switch scanning. So he's scanning with his head. And then he goes through the animal choices 2 or 3 times and then finally makes its selection. And from the time I asked the question to the selection was 2 minutes. I mean, he was engaged in that. It wasn't just dead silence, but he was engaged in that. But that is a long time to wait for a single word. Um,
Mhm.
but he was so engaged meaning he was so excited about it, but you realize he's processing language, but something would happen and he would startle, right? Like all the startle reflex. And then he'd cough and he'd do these different things. It's like just keeping his body engaged enough to do two-step scanning was so laborious, but he was so proud of the story when it was all done. And I love that video. It's a painful thing to send to like play in a class because it's 2 minutes long, but you almost want to because you want people to go,
Mhm.
listen, sometimes this is what literacy looks like. Sometimes this is what word choice looks like in AAC. It's giving them the time to go all the way through this, the scan choices, especially because he was still kind of linear in that way. And I think about how much learned passivity happens when we don't wait. And that learned passivity is so dangerous. We should be afraid of it. We should be afraid of teaching kids that if they just do nothing, we will reduce it to a yes, no question. Or if they
Mhm.
just do nothing, we will simplify the task, right? We should be afraid of being part of teaching learned passivity,
Mhm.
which I think wait time is huge around that.
And I like what you said, Beth, about giving them that time and that expectant pause, and because it is a teaching strategy that you would say, hey, I'll come back to you. You see this in gen ed classrooms or other in all the classrooms, and it makes sense. But then that kind of stood out to me to say, well, the student really needs that time and that full focus, and that strategy isn't the best for this situation. I really appreciate you pointing that out.
Yeah, and again, there's times that it might be that you might say to everybody, all right, you're going to take a minute and compose your answer. Like I've asked a question, you're going to, tell me what your answer is, and I'll wait and listen, for when you're ready, when everybody's ready,
Mhm.
then respond, as opposed to I'll come back to you. Let me go talk to other people because then it's like, oh, it
Right.
wasn't that important. And am I supposed to like how now do I divide my attention and all of that?
Yeah.
Right.
It's just part of that. Um, it's also a way that we teach advocacy we teach autonomy. Maybe advocacy is the wrong word. Like we teach that autonomy, that we teach that you are important, right? That you are an autonomous individual who what you have to say or write or do is of value to me right now in that moment. And I respect you enough to give you that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and I just think that that's, a way of teaching that individual that I value you, right? Like I value your contributions. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe in you. I believe that you have something to say and that it is worth my time to wait for you to say it or write it.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know what it is and I can't guess it, so I'm gonna wait.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
And
love
I think
that.
when I talk to adult users of adults who use augmentative communication um, and who are um, um, who have developed really competent communication skills using AAC, they'll tell you like you know I'll come back to you with that answer. Let me compose my answer. Come back to me. Or please wait and don't finish my sentence. Or I've had
Mm-hmm.
some that have said, you are more than welcome to, and sometimes they'll have a message on their device, like saying, you know, you're welcome to, finish that sentence if that helps our speed, or please don't finish my sentence for you.
Mm-hmm.
Just really interesting when you talk to adults who are using who have access to robust communication and are using it effectively. You have to listen to what they want, but we have to start off by giving those younger learners that respect, that what they're producing is what they're generating is really really important.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
So in the field of AAC and literacy, what do you feel most passionate about? Do you have a certain kind of focus or passion?
I mean, I think it comes down to like, the David Yoder quote, nobody is to anything to be able to read, write, and play. A lot of times people leave the and play off of that
Oh
quote.
yeah.
Nobody is to anything to read and write, but it's nobody is to anything to read, write, and play.
Mm,
And it's that it's that presuming competence, but it's also um, everybody has the ability to make progress from where they are now, right?
mm-hmm.
It's also kind of that philosophy of I can't do that yet, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it's not that, sometimes people think that presuming competency means assuming that everybody is cognitively intact all the time, right? No, we know that. We know that there are individuals who have cognitive disabilities, right? But it's that presuming competence of nobody is to anything to make progress, to go from point A to point B, and maybe for someone, point A is here and point B is all the way here, but maybe for someone else, point B is here, or it's point A, point 5 before you get to point B.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's just having that, that belief that somebody is going to make progress and looking at the small things. Over the years,
When we interviewed Musselwhite, she said there's presumed competency, and if they're not competent, then we're presuming potential,
right,
right?
exactly.
And
That
that's kind of what you're talking about too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That potential, and I mean, it's interesting, over the years, people make us, those of us who are in the field of special education, they make us, or who work with people with disabilities, they make us out to be like, oh, you are such a wonderful person. You work with kids with disabilities. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, first of all, I get paid for it. So it's not like I'm
Mm-hmm.
completely altruistic. And second of all, it's like, it's not this like, I'm not it's not like this totally like, I'm just this really good person. I'm really not that good of a person, right? It's that you learn to look for the small steps that people make, and you take joy in that progress instead of bemoaning what they haven't done yet, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there was years ago that I worked, I was actually a supervisor at that point. I was a supervisor in early childhood, in our early childhood programs in our school district. And I went out with a staff member who was doing a home visit for a young child who had very significant disabilities, was very motorically complex. They weren't sure at all what she was perceiving, hearing, vision. Her body was, very limited um, with purposeful movement that she was able to control. And it was really all about like over a period. So I went out over a period of time just to support and coach this staff member, because they were like ready to be like, well, I don't know why we're doing this. I'm like, well, because at 3 years old, you don't stop providing services for kids,
Right.
let alone. But it was like showing like, hey, look, remember last time, she didn't turn her head when you jingled those bells, and this time she turned her head when she jingled those bells. And and then next time, like, oh, not only did she like turn her head when you jangled those bells, but she like looked up at you like when you stopped, like do it again, right? It's those little things. It's really about those incremental steps and recognizing them, and using that, really paying attention to the data that way.
Mm-hmm.
When we have interviewed parents on here, one of the moms, I remember, whether it was on the recording or a sidebar, but she was like, I got really good at celebrating inch stones instead of milestones, and I have taken that with me over the years, because it is kind of the privilege and the joy of working with the population is getting to celebrate inch stones, right? Because every small increment works that direction. But what you're talking about too is sometimes people think we're gonna, they're 9, they don't know how to read, they've had instruction for 6 years. If they don't have it now, they're never going to get it. We're moving on to life skills, like you already mentioned. And I mean, I've had kids as young as 10. They're not doing any more academics. And I thought, let's say it takes the rest from 10 to 21 to have some literacy skills, even if it's being able to identify the first letter of a target word, right? Worth it. Totally worth it. I mean, the amount of the autonomy, the increase in autonomy, the increase in the ability to say something that's not in your device, right? I mean, the only way you get to say exactly what you want to say is if you spell it, because not every word is pre-programmed. So, I think that celebrating those inch stones is important. And I think some of that has to do with the way IEPs are written and objectives are written within that, so that you are showing gain, and you're not trying to, you're celebrating every step of the way. The backfire is my own children. I'll be like, you walk and talk, go. Like I have no patience for they better be making big strides, because the physical limitations are so challenging when in working on accessing literacy and things like that. But I think those inch stones are so critical, not only for this child and for the parent, but for retention of staff. Like, you have to know that you are making progress and that you are making a difference. And I think when people feel like, oh, goals not met, it's like, let's change the goal, because
And with
we're
that,
making gains.
yeah, and with that, I think we have to look so carefully and stop assuming that the barriers are within that person, but instead that they're the barriers that are imposed by the strategies or the tools or the resources or the philosophies that we're using. Because if a child, even a child with significant disabilities, if they're, if your response is, well, we've been giving them literacy instruction for 6 years and they haven't made any progress and it's time to move on to functional life skills, my response is, well, let's take a look at what exactly was the literacy instruction. What did that literacy instruction actually look like? Because if it doesn't look, if what you're actually doing is not like, so go back and look, oh, well, we do letter of the week. Well, we know letter of the week is not the most effective way, or we symbolate text, or we are working on, we're using a sight word curriculum to teach them. Well, we know none of those things are actually effective reading and literacy strategies. Or we do hand over hand, or we give them papers to trace, or right. So let's back up before we say this kid isn't making progress. Let's back up and really look carefully and critically at the type of literacy instruction that we are delivering, because chances are the barriers have been within that and not within the disability of that child. Because I've seen too many kids with significant disabilities that when given really high quality, best practice literacy instruction, comprehensive literacy instruction, that they do make changes, they do make gains. And again, I'm not talking about going from emergent to conventional in one school year for that kid that has significant disabilities. I'm talking about that we can see data-driven changes, that we can see increases in letter recognition, that we see increases when we give them good access to alternative pencils, that we actually see, where they are starting to develop written communication skills, all of that, right? But we have to really carefully examine what we are doing before we say they're not making progress, because it's probably much more tied to what we do as instructionally. And I know I've done crappy literacy instruction. I have done lousy literacy instruction in the past, right? And so it's okay. Like you read and you change and you research and listen to, awesome podcasts like this, and change what you're doing. And so, you don't give up on you don't give up on that. I've seen too many teenagers and young adults with complex needs developing skills when other people had given up on them.
Yes, we've heard from AAC users who said, I taught myself because nobody was teaching me, so I did it. And going back to what you were saying, it's kind of like you need to be an observer first and observe and provide the right tools and strategies. And I was thinking about, Brenda, talking about taking video and how we're so lucky to have that, like just all the documentation and pictures of their beginning writing. And then you really see how that changes. And especially for families, how great is it to come into an IEP meeting and say, look at this, these are some evidence of how their literacy has changed, and instead of all the things they're not doing still. So I love that. I love that perspective. Just don't give up.
Right. The other thing I know about you, Beth, and because we've talked about it before, and is that as the kids get older, adjust the stimuli to be age appropriate. That's one thing that you and I've talked about a lot, because it's like we think, oh, we're teaching emergent literacy skills. Here's Brown Bear. And yet you are 10 years into Brown Bear. And I have my own experience with that. I have dyslexia. And I remember in kindergarten, we had to read this quote reading textbook that was called Six Ducks in a Pond. And every year I read Six Ducks in a Pond till third grade. And everyone knew it was a baby book. Everyone knew it was a kindergarten book. They had no other book at that reading. And, it was thick. It was chapters of this, and no other book at my reading level. So I read that book for 4 years.
Mm.
And I never got better. See, my third grade teacher finally just handed me a third grade book, and I read it. I just they just were hammering this the only way they knew how to do the very beginning of instruction was something that was so quickly not age appropriate, and the motivation and the just the self-perception, right? Of just like, I am still reading a baby book. I must not be smart. I mean, all the things that our kids must tell ourselves when we stick with not age respectful material as we're teaching emergent literacy. I'm sure you have stuff to say about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and there's so many. Oh, absolutely. It kind of, it's age respectful. It's matching to student interests.
Mhm.
It's the idea of repetition with variety. If we're just doing the same thing over and over again and we're not changing things up, it's repetition with variety where we're changing things up, but we're not just abandoning something and going on to something that's completely different. Yeah, right. There's so much. And the thing is, there's so much high quality children's literature out there that can be used across age levels. There's so many resources that we can use to generate and create our own materials, right? To make things that are age respectful, that are going to meet those needs. There's just not any excuses for anybody that's still reading The Hungry Caterpillar and Brown Bear, past second grade with any readers. Like, I'm so sorry,
Mhm.
but that's just not, there's just so much more out there that we can find, and there's access to it, right? Free, right? Like, there's fabulous websites that are out there. I love Unite for Literacy. And that's is a free resource for digital picture books that is available out there. And yes, some of the picture books in there are totally for much younger kids, but there's a lot of picture books in there that are totally appropriate with older kids. There's resources that are free for teachers, like Epic, where you can find so many different books available on there. There's tools. I mean, everybody's got technology. I mean, I work for Lesson Picks. You can create loads of books, custom books in Lesson Picks, but you can use PowerPoint, you can use Google Slides. We have no dearth of resources available,
Mhm.
for doing that. And finding, like, even things like, I know for me, one of the things that's most challenging is, so we talk about Dakota. There's two different kinds of text that we often use with emergent learners, with emergent readers. And those are predictable text and decodable text, right? So
Mhm.
predictable text would be a book like Brown Bear, or The Hungry Caterpillar, where I can look at that book, look at the pictures, hear it, and know that there is a predictable line that I can fill in and I can figure out what's happening. Now, sometimes that type of book is great for language. When you're working on language, like, that kind of a book can be fantastic for working on language, because you're going to get a sentence stem in there that you're just going to change up a little bit, and you can really practice, that I see, right, whatever it is. That you can practice. And so a book like that, and I don't mean Brown Bear for little kids, I mean for older kids, but I mean a book with predictable text like that,
Mhm.
I can use, and it can be wonderful for language. At the same time, that's not teaching literacy, because I don't actually need to be able to read anything to read that book. All I have to do is memorize the sentence stem, the predictable text, and then fill in based on what the picture is on the page that I'm seeing, right? And that's the problem with, when people look at the types of reading experiences that have been going on in general ed until fairly recently, with the whole changes to the science of reading. We're really paying attention to the science of reading, have been issues. And there's been this shift to using what's called decodable text. And that's where you have a text that is comprised primarily of words and like words with letters and word forms in it, word families that have been explicitly taught, right? And so that's where you get, Ned likes red. Ned has a red bed. Ned fed his teddy bear, right? Like you're getting
Right.
into, you want to have something because you've explicitly taught the short E and you've taught that word family ED. And so now you want to have application to it. And a lot of times, that can be really boring and it can seem very age like not age appropriate or not age if you're looking at some of those commercially available decodable readers that are out there. And so a thing that I recently started doing is I started using AI like ChatGPT or I actually like Bard better for this. Bard is the Google product. ChatGPT is Microsoft product. So I said I put in for my prompt was write a 5-sentence story with words that rhyme with, and I'll put in like if it's hat, words that rhyme with hat, and that is about about something like that takes place in a in trying to think of something that would be like interesting, right? That takes place
the ocean, or
right, whatever it is,
dinosaurs, or whatever the kid's interest is.
Whatever the kid's interest is. And so it'll give me and it's never complete. It never is it's not perfect, but it gives me a place to start. So, there's tools out there where we can create the resources that our students need. There's not an excuse to say, well, there's nothing for those kids, because there is. And if you can't find it commercially available, then just make it. And it doesn't have to be, the other thing is it doesn't have to be perfect or pretty or, outstanding all the time. It can be simple, but find those resources that you can. So, my little AI tip of the day is you can use it to decodable text.
That's a great tip.
Yeah.
That's a great tip. I love that. We're still lucky. I mean, we're lucky with AI, and we're lucky that there are just so many resources around now that you can find it if you know where to look. And if you don't, then ask somebody.
Yeah.
But I mean, sometimes that's what, I feel like that's what a lot of people say, even when we get on consults, is they just need an idea and then they can run with it, which is kind of what you're saying. Like GPT or Bard can give you an idea, and you're a speech pathologist, so you can make sure you can add the components of a narrative, or you can make sure that there's, it's a more complete narrative story, so that when you shift off of decoding, you can focus on WH questions, or however you want to implement the AAC part to the literacy. But, just getting the idea, it's okay, now I have a context. Now I know, all these rhyming words with at, can go together with the student directed, interest, right? So I love that idea. And I think that's another thing we get a lot of is well, what does it look like? What does AAC instruction look like? How do we, not AAC, excuse me, what does AAC and literacy instruction look like? I mean, even when you read Comprehensive Literacy for All, they have a ton of examples in there, but can you generalize that? Can you then go, okay, well, the kid in the book had this interest. My kid has that interest. How am I making that work? They're working on first letter, or they're working on word endings, or they're working on prefixes, or they're working on suffixes, right? So it's how can I vary the instruction to be student directed and at their level? And I think it's such a great idea, Beth, to be we'll use the resources that are available, and a lot of them are free. And Epic came big, I think, in 2020 when we were doing a lot of online stuff, and it was well, what do you want to read about? I mean, because I don't have to own that book. I'm not hitting bars. I mean, think about how much money we spent at like Barnes and Nobles, even before Amazon was very big, of just buying books all the time. Now I'm dating myself, but yeah, I love the free resources is like unheard of in our careers earlier, right? And now it's like, oh my gosh, what's at your fingertips?
Beth, okay, back to school. I'm excited about literacy. I've got all these ideas. If I'm new to literacy for this population, what's your suggested starting point?
I mean, the first thing I would do is I would sit down and read, Brenda mentioned it, I would read the book Comprehensive Literacy for All by David Copenhaver and Karen Erickson. It is going to provide a really great baseline for understanding what to do to start working with students with significant disabilities and literacy. It's not going to give you step-by-step directions for everything, right? But it's definitely going to give you that kind of background. I mean, so that's definitely, that would probably be, the place that I would start as far as that. But for somebody who's like walking in and is like, oh my God, I don't have time. Like, that's a book. I don't have time. Like, somebody should have told me that back in June. I would say one of the most effective things to start with is simply by starting with the protocol of letter of the day, right? So it used to be, so when I was in, and this isn't that long ago, right? So like 5 years ago, I was an assistant principal, right? I'm walking into a kindergarten classroom, gen ed kindergarten classroom, and they're doing letter of the week. And there was already really good research. There's been research for a while that says that letter of the week is not an effective way to develop alphabet knowledge. That letter of the day is much more effective. And it's simply because of the numbers, right? So when we do letter of the week, we don't even get through the whole alphabet 2 times, right? We don't get through the alphabet 2 times. When we do letter of the day, we have the potential to get through the alphabet like up to 6 times a year.
What a difference.
Right. And so really doing this and we get to more of the letters. I mean, you feel so sorry for the kid whose name starts with T, right? Like, or Sarah, your name is with an S. And like, if we do letter of the, because your name is, I always ask teachers, I ask teachers, what do you think is the most important letter? What's the most important letter? And people are like, well, the letter A or the letter T, because it comes, it's so often, or the letter, whatever. And the answer is the most important letter is the letter that every student's name starts with. So for every student, it's the letter that their name starts with. And so when we do a letter of the day, within the first 26 days of school, we're going to have hit the first letter of every single kid's name. So, right. So, it's not the first month because you're not talking weekends and everything, but by, October, you're going to have hit every kid's, the first letter of every kid's name in the alphabet. So starting off with that, just a really practical thing that a teacher can walk into a classroom and change a practice. And again, not just for kindergarten, this would be all the way through. If you're working with learners with complex needs, having a letter of the day where everything, you've got both explicit and embedded instruction around that letter. And it's okay that that your learners aren't going to get, not every learner is going to get it right away, right? But it's okay because you're going to keep cycling back to that. And you're not going to ignore all the other letters. You might be, it might be letter of the day, might be, G, but you come across a word and you talk about, oh, remember we did the letter of the day A already, and this word starts with A, right? You don't just forget about all the other letters only for that, but having that. So that would be, I think it's like an easy thing that that folks are used to doing, like a letter of the week kind of thing, is just changing it up to letter of the day. So that would, just walk in and try that and see the impact that has. And then remember when you're teaching letters that it's not just the letter name, it's the letter name, it's the letter sound, right? it's the letter form, right? So you've got to be explicit about all three of those things. It's not just one or the other.
Right.
Um,
Good advice.
In the book too, they talk about letter of the week. That's like, it's like, if once you figure out what the letters of the week is, then no critical thinking is required. The answer is always D, because it's the letter of
right.
the week is D. When you're doing it by day, then they're doing some critical thinking, like, oh, that sounds different than yesterday's
Right.
letter. That looks different than yesterday's letter. That's voiced. I mean, they're not speech pathologists, so they're not thinking about um, you know, the difference between a s and a z, right? But they're having to use some problem solving, some critical thinking skills to go, okay, it wasn't yesterday's letter, or look at that, that's a word. Sarah has S and A, and we just did A last. Like, they're more aware of the rest of the word. I think sometimes when you're doing letter of the week too, you're only focused on first letter. And so when you're doing letter of the day, you're noticing the letters that you've just done in the rest of the word, So I think it makes a lot more sense to do it that way. And I think you're right. I think it's letter of the week is still a pretty common practice, even general education. And I think it's such a good place to start, something that people can start tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great little book out there. Like, I have it on my shelf, but I don't see it to pull off right now. There's a great little book out there. It's literally like an 80-page booklet called No More Teaching a Letter of the Week. And it's all about the research behind letter of the day. It's written from a gen ed perspective. It's written from a kindergarten kind of ish perspective, but there's a lot of great things in there that special educators, or that people that are working with even older students with more complex needs at an emergent literacy level can take away from that. So it's a great, like, you don't have time to read comprehensive literacy for all, just do the little, no more teaching letter of the week.
Yeah, we'll have to check that out. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, gosh, I feel like this has just flown by. So what do you want people to know about the work you're doing right now, Beth?
Wow. I mean, I work for Lesson Picks. My day job is I work for Lesson Picks. And so check out Lesson Picks and see all the awesome literacy resources that are there. But I do much more than Lesson Picks. And so I'm going to be presenting with Brenda one of my sessions at Closing the Gap. We need to start planning that, don't we?
No.
We're presenting at Closing the Gap, and I'm presenting a number of sessions at Closing the Gap that'll be in Minneapolis in October. I will be at the Talking AAC conference in Michigan, which is like the week after Closing the Gap. I will be at ASHA, both at the Lesson Picks booth, but I'll also be presenting at ASHA as well. So just lots of different things going on. And, if somebody's like, wow, I would love for Beth to come and talk to my group, reach out to me. I do presentations for different school districts and different groups as well. So
Great.
Yeah,
busy.
lots of ways to come and check out things that I'm doing.
Is the best way to get a hold of you through email? And if so, we can post that with this.
Yeah. The best way to get a hold of me. So you can always reach out to me at my personal email, which is posbeth@gmail.com. Or if what you really want to know about is Lesson Picks, just email me at beth@lessonpicks.com. And you can reach out to me about either email. It doesn't really matter. I'll respond no matter what.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much. This flew by because you're so practical and you gave so many nice examples, I think, that people can apply right away. So that was super helpful. Thanks so much, Beth, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.